So, do you know the name Alexander Cruden? Does this name ring any bells to you? Is this a name you're familiar with? You did not ever meet Alexander Cruden. He is Scottish and he lived in the early 1700s. He is a historical figure. Is this a name that rings a bell to you? Alexander Cruden. Do you know that name? He is sort of a minor character in history, I guess. It wouldn't be shocking if you didn't know it. Alexander Cruden is known as the man. He is the man who will be known as the guy who unwrote the Bible. He's known as the man who unwrote the Bible. In our language today, we would say that Alexander Cruden deconstructed the Bible. He was the first person to have this idea, and he is the person who did it. So this is a Strong's exhaustive concordance of the Bible. This one is for the King James Version. Strong is a different person than Alexander Cruden. James Strong. Find every occurrence of any word in the Bible. So if you wanted to know where the word faith appears in the Bible, you would look it up in this book and it would give you every reference in the Bible for the word faith. It's a concordance. Alexander Cruden is the forefather, the first person to ever think of breaking the Bible down this way. He wrote the first ever concordance of the Bible. He's known for unwriting or deconstructing the Bible. So like every occurrence of the word "the" that's in the Bible, he documented this and put it into a book, so you could look that up if you ever wanted to know where the 1 million words "the" are. You can find that in the concordance. All right. He is the person who came up with this. His name is Alexander Cruden. Alexander Cruden was off the charts smart. He was a pastor. He spoke several languages, spoke and worked in several languages. Scottish, obviously, because he was Scottish, but French, Greek. He worked and spoke in Latin. He was a very smart guy. He was one of the founders of the University of Aberdeen, a sort of very old, still in existence university. He was considered very smart in his day. And the thing about Alexander Cruden is his story is super strange. Not only was he smart, but he had a super strange story. He left home at some point in his life and never went back. He left home and never went back. He had this brain that was able to deconstruct, patiently deconstruct every single word in the Bible before computers and make a concordance. He knew all these languages. He had all these things that he hoped for and dreamed for. And he was sort of so intellectual and that he was kind of different from other people. He left home, never went back. He got in all sorts of trouble with people. He ended up being in and out of insane asylums, even though he was so smart. And this is the story of Alexander Cruden, the man who unwrote the Bible. If you Google that name, Alexander Cruden, Cruden, you would find like a Wikipedia article that would tell you more about him. If you Google concordance, Strong's or whatever, it would tell you more about what that is. This is a little brief introduction of Alexander Cruden, the man who unwrote the Bible, and I am talking about him as a segue into preparing for Sunday, where you and I join together and take a look at the upcoming week's scripture lectionary text. This is for Sunday, January 30th, 2022. It is lectionary week. We're still in the season of Epiphany, so it's a lectionary Epiphany 4, the 4th week of Epiphany, year C, so the Luke year of the Gospel. So this is Sunday, January 30th, 2022, Lectionary Sunday, Epiphany 4, Year C. This text for this week from the Gospel is from Luke chapter 4, verses 21 through 30. Luke chapter 4, 21 through 30. Because we're in the season of Epiphany, we're still fairly close to having just moved through the season of Christmas. So technically, for all purposes here, we're still sort of at the front end of the story. We're in Luke chapter 4. This Sunday is verses 21 through 30. You could pause this or stop it if you're at home, and you could read those verses if you would like. Luke chapter 4, 21 through 30. These verses are a continuation of last week's. So the first half of the Gospel of Luke was read as our Gospel in services and over video for Lectionary 3C. This is 4C, 1 week past, but it really connects to last week's Gospel where Jesus goes back to Nazareth, to his hometown. In the story from last week, he gets up in the synagogue and reads part of the scroll from Isaiah and kind of gets people looking at him askance because he says, today this has been fulfilled in your hearing. He has the gall to say today. In Luke chapter 4, the story moves from people being amazed to people being upset with. They're amazed at Jesus and then they're upset with him. And for this, preparing for Sunday, really what I'm thinking about is this sort of pivot point. This is more of a sort of topical entrance into this week's text. I'm thinking about hometowns, and I'm thinking about Nazareth is Jesus' hometown. I'm thinking about going home again, and I'm thinking about the sort of dichotomy between leaving home to accomplish things or staying at home to know who you are and where you've come from. So I'm thinking of hometowns, and I'm thinking of how sometimes they propel you into who you're going to become. You learn lessons there that you take with you out into life, and that's part of what a hometown or a family is about. But I'm thinking about how also they are a place that you don't ever really leave, where tradition came to you from. You always go back there, and it's part of you is always from there. And I'm kind of thinking of this dichotomy. I was really kind of trying to capture that by telling you about Alexander Cruden. And again, less than being a sort of Bible study, this is much more a sort of topical study of a point from within the text. Excuse me. So I was thinking about Alexander Cruden, and the guy who eventually would go off to found colleges and unwrite the Bible in such a way that we still use concordances, we still use his legacy to this day, but that he left home and he never returned. So to get all this stuff done, he sort of had to step out and never went back. I'm also thinking about how out where he was, his mind was so sort of full of things, and his life got involved in so many things that he, maybe forgot where he came from a little bit, was confused, untethered. He ended up in asylums off and on throughout his life. And so I was using that idea of Alexander Cruden to sort of explain to you a little bit of history, but also to fit this idea of hometowns. You don't want to get stuck there, but you don't ever really leave there. I'm kind of thinking of that dichotomy, and I'm thinking of that because in Luke chapter 4, Jesus is in his hometown, and he is thought of and received in a certain way there in his hometown. And this is what all of Luke chapter 4 is about. Specifically now, Luke 4, 21 through 30 gets to the sort of conclusion of that episode. And so I'm thinking about hometowns, I'm thinking about church history, a little tiny little segment of it in Alexander Cruden, and I'm thinking of Jesus and his hometown. Jesus' hometown is, of course, Nazareth. That's where he goes in this text that we'll read together this Sunday. He returns to Nazareth. Nazareth has never been identified. So we have all sorts of archaeological evidence of lots of place names that are named or listed in the Bible. Nazareth has never been found with any certainty. We do not know where this site was. We do know a few things about it, but we don't know where it was. It was tiny. It was a tiny town. That in part probably lends itself to why it really hasn't been found. It probably was not a big place. In the ancient world, there probably weren't as big of population numbers as we have today anyway. Places were probably much more sparse at that point. Even cities were probably not the same scale as cities are today. And Nazareth is certainly a tiny, essentially an inconsequential place. We can't even find it now. It hasn't ever been located. It is in what I'll call the sort of northern part of the biblical nation, the biblical area of Israel. It is in a pretty, I guess, sort of, let's call it mountainous area. We don't really know where in all that area it is. We have ideas, but we haven't been able to pinpoint it. This was probably a very small and a very secluded community because of the mountains that were around it. It was probably based a lot on farming. They basically could only support the number of people that they could grow things for. Because it's mountainous, they weren't able to just, and because it's the ancient world, they weren't able to just have millions of acres of corn or whatever to support themselves. There was no importing, exporting the same way that there would be now. So this is a little small, cut-off place that's thriving on planting and growing. You know, they're not at the sea, so they can't, you know, have fish or whatever. So we haven't been able to pinpoint it. It's a small place, and this is the place where Jesus is at in the 4th chapter of Luke. And what I'm thinking about with this continues to be this idea of leaving your hometown to accomplish things on the one hand, but how you can never really leave where you're from and how that's where your identity comes from. And I'm thinking of all these pieces and parts of, you know, Jesus coming into his hometown. Jesus' hometown was so small that they surely knew of his birth history. So you remember at Christmas we talked about the history of Jesus' birth. Jesus was born of Mary. We call her the Virgin Mary. And so, you know, it's a little fascinating to think that he would go back to Nazareth. Alexander Cruden never went back to his hometown, and maybe he experienced the world in such a way that going back was unthinkable for him. And you can imagine Jesus going back and people calling his mom names. You know, he has a sort of sordid or unusual background, of course. This is God, something that is totally other, coming to maybe the smallest and most inconsequential place imaginable. And how the people would feel about that would probably be somewhat mixed. They probably had a lot of yo mama jokes for Mary and those sorts of things. Because it doesn't have the same sort of lineage that people in a small secluded town would be used to. And, you know, I think about Jesus' exposure to the other, to Samaritans or to populous cities prior to this, and that he comes and he's different, right? By the end of Luke, Luke has the story unfold week after week as we will follow it through the lectionary, and Jesus goes on a journey, and Luke explains it that way. It is a journey, it is a trip, it is a thing that he's beginning here in some ways. I wouldn't say beginning because we've had some other chapters in Luke, but his public ministry is beginning in Nazareth, his hometown, and you can never really get away from your hometown. And he has this sort of sordid history to be God and come to this place with a lineage like his. But Luke makes it very clear that Jesus is a traveling book. a traveling person. Luke is a traveling book where Jesus travels, goes on a journey, takes up his thoughts and takes up his disciples and heads, sets his face to Jerusalem. The plot of Luke is about traveling. It's a travelogue to Jerusalem, and it's Jesus, what he does on the way there. And this is the first stop. It's in Nazareth. And while the whole book is about journeying, like Alexander Cruden going off to accomplish things, this part is about being in one's hometown and the peril that comes with that. For a minute it was like, wow, this guy's really astute. This guy's very learned. Listen to how he reads these scrolls. It's beautiful. It's so well done. We appreciate him. And we're amazed at him. And then it goes to rage at the things he would have to say about the scroll and about who he is. And there's this dichotomy, and it's like the audience, the people of Nazareth who end up upset with Jesus, are living in both at once. We're proud of him. Like, look at this cool guy who's done so much. On the other hand, who is this guy to have done so much? Have you ever felt that sort of dichotomy? I told you earlier about the story of Alexander Cruden, who unwrote the Bible. He was unmoored. His brain, maybe he lived in his brain so much that it caused sort of difficulties, and he didn't have a foundation. He never went back home. I'm thinking too of Jesus, who in this story does go back home, but it's so complicated and sordid that people don't know what to make of him. And again, as opposed to a lot of the theological background this week or the biblical textual background, I'm thinking of this sort of topical background of hometowns, of where we're from. And I'm thinking of how that fits for you and I. People who at this point have had enough of the world that we live in. We know all about COVID, but have something that's been happening around us even before COVID. It's exacerbated by COVID, but we have this thing where we're not sure how we feel about going home. Like, we're just through the holidays, right? Think about going home for Thanksgiving or going home for Christmas and the challenges that poses at this point. We don't know how we feel about it because mom or dad might vote differently than we do. We don't know how to feel about it because Uncle Bobby is all the time, going on and on about this conspiracy theory that I don't want to hear about, or whatever. And so I'm really thinking about this dichotomy about where we're from and where we go. Is it important to have a family that supports you, that tells you who you are, who your ancestors are? And how important is it to be able to have your own life outside of your family? You want to be told who you are and where your ancestors came from, and you want to cling on to that. You want to learn from it. You want to have traditions that give you a grounding, but you don't want to feel locked into that either. Like, you have to live in the basement of your own house for forever. It's sort of like you want to go off to college and accomplish things. And I've been thinking, not in much of a uniform way, as you can tell, but just this idea of going back home. That's the context of Luke chapter 4. It's something that you and I feel. It's something that was a part of Alexander Cruden's life. And so this is really where I'm coming from for this week. How inconsequential Nazareth is. How they move from amazement to rage within just a few verses. They're amazed at Jesus and his power. I mean, this is God who comes from somewhere else and comes all the way to them, and they're amazed about it. But it doesn't take them very long to be angry about it. So this week I'm thinking about where we're from, and I guess to think about that and prepare is to think about who you are. Where are you from? What nationality are you? What meals do you prepare? Who are your grandparents? Where did they live? Where did you come from? Why is that important? Traditions. We worship together as Lutherans. Why are some of our traditions important? We say that we gather together with all the saints and we do some of the same routine things. Why is this important? Well, I guess in theory it gives us a pin to put onto the map to say, when all else is going haywire, this is who I am, this is where I'm from. It's a place where you can sort of let your hair down, you can relax, and that's what it means to be from somewhere. But Luke, from chapter 4 on, especially into Holy Week, is going to have Jesus set his face to Jerusalem. Jesus essentially knows, God essentially knows, that the whole mission isn't Nazareth. I think if the whole mission would have been Nazareth, the story probably wouldn't have even been passed down to us. Jesus goes to Jerusalem because Jesus has a call to accomplish something else. So on the same hand where we think about where we're from, where have we gone? Where would we like to go? Does God call us to take who we are and sometimes be about something else? We leave our homes and we travel to work. And maybe that's a really pointed way to talk about who we are and where we're from and how we go somewhere else to accomplish something or have a purpose. Church is meant to be a place that gathers us in our faith home, and it reminds us of who we are. It's a baseline week after week. These are my people. This is where I belong. Even though you might not all vote the same way, and you might have your crazy Uncle Bobby here too. But we all don't stay here. We are on a journey from here to somewhere else. What is the significance of being from somewhere and being able to travel to journey somewhere else? I don't know that I'm answering that as much as I'm just saying these are the thoughts that are going through my mind with this week's text, Luke chapter 4, verses 21 through 30. For the first reading, I've included the text from Isaiah that talks about prophets speaking. I think for the sake of preparing for Sunday, perhaps instead of that text, Ecclesiastes would be a little bit better. In terms of this dichotomy and being from places but trying to go out in the world and make your own mark and being two things at once. Maybe there's a time for everything under heaven. Ecclesiastes is maybe a little bit better fit lectionary. Not to say I'm changing it, I am not changing it, but I mean for the context of this preparing, maybe the idea that sometimes we're at home and sometimes we're away, and we wear different hats, we behave different ways, we have different callings or purpose in different places. Those places have different meaning for us, but how God is part of both of them. God is in our hometown, our home, and God is in the journey and where the places where we go out to accomplish too. We might be different people in both places. The reactions might be different, but God sees us through those things. So to prepare for Sunday, maybe read Luke chapter 4, 21 through 30. You could Google Alexander Cruden and hear the life story of a kind of interesting guy. You can think too, I think, of who you are, where you're from, ways that you see God from your mom or your grandparents passing faith down to you. Would you have faith without that? And how grateful we are for God in our history. But then too, as we gather for worship, we are made God's people. We reflect on who God makes us, but we use that energy, the nourishment of our meal together, as energy to go out and to journey and to be called and to accomplish things in the world that we're from. Lutheran liturgy follows a pattern. It begins with a gathering where we all kind of come back home again. And by the time it's done, we'll have a meal together, we'll share the word, we'll talk together, we'll share a meal together, and then it ends with sending. So then you're not just expected to be gathered in, you're also called to be sent ones. And this is really what I'm playing with, the idea of how hard it is to talk about things at your family table at Christmas, and how hard it is to talk about them at work. Who God makes us, how God gives us the skills to speak to Uncle Bobby and our cubicle mates or whatever. And this, to me, is the background of Jesus in Nazareth, what he says and what he does. So hopefully this has been something to think about, and as you think about where you're from, and you think about the places where you're called, we can gather Sunday, be reminded of who we are, and hear once again what our calling might look like, and how that goes with us. So hopefully that was thought-provoking. I don't know that this week I tried to give you a lot of answers, maybe more just give you some of the things I'm thinking. As always, I truly hope that you stay safe. I would love for you to call if you need anything, if you have any questions, if you'd like to chat, feel free. Please stay safe, and I am looking forward to seeing you when we gather on Sunday. See you soon.